What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
This is San Francisco.
The alt-right media pipeline and the Manosphere, the Joe Rogans and Andrew Tates of the world, people with huge online followings, they helped Trump reascend to the American throne despite the fact that the Kamala Harris campaign outspent Trump's campaign by a very, very large amount of money. People are getting politicized and forming their identities around what they're hearing on these right-wing podcasts, on TikTok. They target a lot of cis straight men, but in the same net get caught people of marginalized identities, queer people, people who are Asian American. On this episode is Ome, who studies sociology, and on TikTok, you should definitely follow them at Sugar Skull Angelic, where I have learned so much, not only about the topic of today's episode, but also how the US's relationship to Mexico should actually scandalize anyone. They also talk a lot about capitalism and the waning days of US empire, and we'll have links to some of the sources that we discussed in the show notes. Ome, thank you so much for doing this. I wanted to start out by asking, since I have long admired you from through the screen, but I don't know, actually, when did you start doing political content?
So I had a video that went viral, I think last year, after the Morena party, which is the primary political party in Mexico, passed a resolution for a judicial reform. And it made me realize that most Mexican Americans don't know anything about Mexican politics. And most Americans especially don't know anything about Mexican politics. And I think it was really jarring to me to see that Mexican Americans don't know anything about Mexican politics, particularly because I live in Mexico part-time, and those policies absolutely affect us here in the States. And of course, have ramifications and implications for people who have family in Mexico. So that's what ultimately started getting me doing political content from my original fashion content.
I like the content you do because you do bring in other pop cultural moments. You have a video about a tutorial on Taobao, which I appreciated, how to obtain things that are the prices are super jacked up on Amazon, when you can get them direct from the places that they're actually made in China for much cheaper. But yeah, thanks for that context. I wanted to also ask, when did you realize that there was a parallel world online where it's basically cis guys getting radicalized by the right, which is the topic of the podcast today?
I would say that as early as high school, I really learned that there were people who were dedicated to radicalizing men into the alt-right, especially because when I was early on in my high school life, I was very immediately attached to 4chan by proxy of CGL. CGL is a board on 4chan, and it stands for Cosplay and Gothic Lolita. And I was very interested in Lolita street fashion, which is a Japanese street fashion. And as a result of my interest, I ended up getting doxxed by 4chan because somebody posted a photo of me on 4chan, and they basically I got levied with a bunch of attacks, both in person as well as online, which was really enlightening, but also terrifying. And the combination of those things I started to have a lot of questions. I was like, how did this happen? How did literally people get my address? And it made me realize that there was an underbelly to the fashion community, but also it exposed me to the other boards on 4chan, which included B, which of course is the like probably cesspool of the internet. I'm a very curious person. I have this rule that if something makes me uncomfortable, I need to look into that and I
Mm,
need to like find out what's going on. And that's when I started learning the lore of 4chan. And so the lore of 4chan is that, it's sort of these like internet tech bros who get together, they make a website and they classify it as news media website. And the way that they legislate or they figure out a way to basically ensure that it stays on the internet without it being like technically a part of the dark web directly is by arguing that it's technically news. And
mm.
so because they're doing this, everybody has access to this. This is not like limited. You can just click the I'm 18. And so I was literally 14 browsing 4chan and looking at like what men were talking about. And it was at this point that I started realizing that there was something called the manosphere. And so the manosphere is where all of the pro-man, like sort of anti-feminist, um, political sort of ideology is birthed from, and it's all alt-right ideology. It's also somewhat affiliated with white supremacy and the Great White Replacement theory, which, sort of posits or argues that white people are being replaced by people of color, and especially white men are culprit in some capacity in participating in this like white genocide. So that really is what put me on to the fact that men were being radicalized into the alt-right and that even men of color were being radicalized into the alt-right by basically, sort of platforming this like white supremacist idea of like dating white women and like superior women and like all this stuff. And of course, I took my first sociology class in community college, and that's when I learned a little bit about sort of like gender studies. And that's when I realized that this was like an infrastructure that was being sort of formally created by white supremacists. So that's what exposed me to it. That's how I got exposed to it really, really early on. And it made me have a lot of questions. And that's how we got here. That's why I know what I know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry that you had to come into it like experiencing it basically firsthand, like the sort of backlash from just like trying to like be involved in this like fashion oriented community. 4chan and like you were talking about that blending of news and sort of right-wing culture. I think it's overtaken for so many people like traditional news, which is what I used to work in. So it's like of special interest to me. I guess to give people an idea like who are coming into this like for the first time, are there other platforms in addition to 4chan that you immediately like think of when you're like trying to explain this manosphere to?
Well, the manosphere includes incels. So it includes people who believe that they are involuntarily celibate. Like I always want to revisit the original definition so that people are very clear about what I'm talking about. And involuntary celibate culture basically led to or opened up to a culture called pickup artist culture. And basically it argues that like in order to like have a girlfriend and to be able to have a sexual life as a man, you have to basically endorse or become a certain like sort of gender stereotype of toxic masculinity.
Mm.
And from that, there was a bunch of podcasts. This is like where we get like the like initial versions of like Joe Rogan, and where you get like pre-Andrew Tate types of content. And when you start getting like all of these like podcasters who are basically making content centered around how you can get a woman. And basically it's all appealing to incel culture and to the manosphere at large. And of course, there's different subsets of men that are like on this alt-right pipeline, and there's different gateways to the pipeline. The point is that this podcast culture really started getting everywhere. You can see it on Facebook now. You can definitely see it on TikTok. Actually, if you open TikTok over again, it is way more likely to show you alt-right content. And especially it's supposed to expose you to male podcast sort of pickup artist culture. And so I think that, and then also the state of politics is sort of like a chicken or egg situation. Like I'm not sure which came first, but there is this sort of narrative around high dominance politics. So this is a theory that like men who are sort of like able to see lion, to gaslight, who act in like this culturally dominant sort of way, like Donald Trump, for example, he's like a pinnacle, like a perfect example of a high dominance politician. Men are very attracted to that because it makes them feel assertive, it makes them feel good, it makes them feel like they're able to do whatever they want. And I think the combination between those things is sort of like a cycle. So like you have high dominance politics and you have podcast culture and you have them sort of working in tandem, a pipeline that's really quick. It's very
Yeah.
high tempo and very effective.
Yeah, and again, in addition to that, we have like sort of decimation of old school news. And so there's like this opening for people to get information from new spaces, including podcasts. You even have a lot of those people going on as experts to legacy media outlets. Like Fox News is, having all of these influencers who might have been just like weightlifting on TikTok for a long time and then started doing like some amount of political content. It's super fascinating how quickly it happened.
The other thing that I think is really interesting too is that all of the social media platforms that we're used to slowly transitioned into something that is 4chan adjacent in the name of
Yeah.
free speech. So
Yeah.
like X in particular, it transitioned to essentially what is 4chan. If you go on Twitter, you can access the same exact content as you can access on 4chan, snuff content, really like sort of fringe porn. You could access all of this political commentary that's like on the very far alt-right. But now you're accessing boomer and more editorialized versions of this on Facebook, on Instagram, tradwife content on Instagram, which is also part of the alt-right pipeline for men, because it's sort of like the woman's role in the manosphere. So I think a lot of people view these sort of like alt-right pipeline gateways as like a myopic or sort of centered sphere or like one specific space, but it's actually everywhere. Everywhere that you go, there is like an opening because Republicans are very inviting people, and Republicanism is sort of like the initial gate of the alt-right. It's like people
Mm,
who are on the alt-right pipeline, they're going to start getting into Republicanism really openly. That's like how they're going to start.
that is super interesting. I didn't think of that as being the gate. Maybe we should have started here, but why do you and I think like a lot of our politics are aligned just based on some of conversations online. Why do we even bother to pay attention to this? Like we're not the targets. Why is it necessary for us to care?
I think we are the targets of the alt-right pipeline.
Mm,
Absolutely. In different capacities, right? So, like, we saw pick-meism in my case being sort of like the primary cultural factor that's coming out of the manosphere to basically get women to fall into the manosphere alt-right
mm.
pipeline. And of course, we see men, gay men especially, even gay men of color, who
Yeah.
totally do get involved in the
Yeah.
alt-right pipeline, who sometimes even sort of come out again as like straight or
I mean, Milo Yiannopoulos.
yeah,
Whoa.
we have gay white supremacists like
Yeah.
and this is a tale as old as time. This is like as old as American history is really. We've had a lot of like class traitors, race traitors, queer traitors, people who have gone into these spaces. But I
Yeah.
think it's really useful to think of them as people who are, at least in their own mind, attached to a narrative that makes them believe that they're doing good. Like if you think of them that way, they make a lot more sense because Milo Yiannopoulos probably does believe in the Great White Replacement theory. He probably believes that there's a white genocide, and because he has those beliefs, because he believes that whiteness and race are biological concepts rather than social constructs. I think a lot of these people can absolutely, leftists even, can absolutely be put on the alt-right pipeline. I also wanted to point out that we've had a lot of people in my own community, Mexicans, who are actively being pulled into the alt-right pipeline. And especially Nick Fuentes is like the perfect example of this. And Latinos in general as well. We have Enrique Tarrio, who is Cuban, and he is one of the leaders of the Proud Boys. So like we have a variety of people who would typically be leftists who are on the alt-right pipeline. And of course, pick-meism and tradwifism, these are all things that are like the complementary women's version of the manosphere. It's like where women's role is inside of the manosphere. So we all contribute to it, right? Anytime that you, as a woman, for example, if you were to basically try to appeal to men, try to appease men, try to be of service to men in a misogynistic way, an internally misogynistic way, you are participating in the manosphere. You're giving your endorsement by engaging in this narrative, by participating in the social culture of it all. It cultivates, it fosters the manosphere. And I think this is possible for gay people. It's possible for queer people to do as well. We see like a huge uptick of like white queers incidentally, which are patriotic socialists.
Hmm.
So patriotic socialists are not real socialists. I don't know if people know, I'm just putting that out there. Patriotic socialists are basically pro-America socialists. So they put America first. And a lot of them believe in the great white replacement theory. But we have a lot of leftists of color who are following these types of people. One of the most like popular ones on TikTok is Cancel This Clothing Company. He is a pat socialist. So he's like totally buys into the ACP, which is the American Communist Party, which is led by Jackson Hinkle, who's an explicit anti-Semite, explicit racist,
Hmm.
and who believes in the Great White Replacement theory and believes that trans people are the way that white people are being replaced. Right. So they,
Yeah, I mean that's happening in Asian America as well. Like,
right.
yeah, like I mean,
Because these
blaming
narratives,
marginalized.
unfortunately, they apply more to people of color. The genocide part is real, right? And so the way
Mhm.
that these socialists sort of like embed themselves into these narratives is that they use things that feel real. Because for white people, they fully believe that women of color, like active action programs, for example, at universities that are like, bringing in more people of color, that these are policies for white people. So like they believe that equity is a threat to their existence.
Yeah.
It's a very adjacent to the truth sort of narrative, and it's very, very hard to fight. We have all sorts of people who can be grabbed by, this manosphere, and anybody can be a part.
Yeah. And again, it's like replacing it is like the principal media that people are getting in a lot of cases. And increasingly as, like this term is so ever present, but I think it's still unfortunately relevant. Like the, loneliness epidemic, like we know people are spending more time alone. We know people are having fewer close friends than people reported in the past, and so it leaves this opening for these parasocial relationships with these podcasters who in some cases might be like the closest thing to like a real friend that people identify as having in their own lives. These things are exactly why we all need to be paying attention to this, unfortunately, whether
Yeah,
we like
yeah,
it
no,
or
I
not.
totally do think that we all are the targets of the manosphere. And I also think that not only are we the targets of it, we all contribute in some way. Like anytime that we say something transphobic, which is pretty much constantly, most Americans say transphobic stuff, we are contributing to the narrative of the alt-right. Everything is an alt-right pipeline, every single
Yeah,
thing.
yeah, yeah.
It's really unfortunate. It like goes as far as food, jewelry, all the way to like literally the customs that people have in their day-to-day life. Like tradwifism, like that is such a weird way to like enter the alt-right pipeline, but not just that, the manosphere. Because it basically it argues that you have to be subservient. So I don't know, I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, yeah. People in the men's rights movement argue that we need to, save the men and that men's egos are hurt right now because they sense that they're losing status in the world. Things like Me Too, where people are actually finally getting called out for sexual assault, like these are things that were just a given for, I guess, men in the past, where it's like, oh yeah, I will never have to answer for that. Finally, like, you have this reaction to like cancel culture and like people who have never been told no in the past, finally like hearing the word no and not, I guess, knowing how to react to it. On one hand, you do have these people who are like men's rights activists, including a lot of women who, feel like we need to get behind men because they're suffering during this time. And I thought maybe we could like differentiate the reason between, why we as feminists are paying attention to the manosphere versus why men's rights advocates are so concerned with the feelings of men.
I mean, I think it's a complicated question, right? So what we're talking about is whether or not we should prioritize men in any space. And I think what that could mean is that instead of viewing it as prioritizing men or trying to like lend them a voice, what we need to do is that in any cases of sexual violence, we need to just acknowledge it. And that could mean a lot of things. Like that could mean like not victim blaming, that could mean like not engaging in sort of like adjacent discourse, because the fact is that a lot of this harm, sexual violence in particular, is very reproductive, meaning that like there's like a normalization culture. So like people basically accept that they're going to be sexually assaulted, and so maybe they like infringe other people's consent, and maybe like, people don't really fully understand consent, and so it becomes this very like reproductive sort of culture because people have a taboo around talking about sexual violence in general. And cancel culture is often conflated with purity and like the ability to be a good person. And not just all of that. In the very end, what we have here is a case of people basically not being able to differentiate what is a good person who's being transparent or a person who's just being transparent. Like online, like there's this culture where when people share, they overshare, like is happening to them, people immediately believe that they're a good person, even if what they're sharing is not necessarily true.
Mm.
Do you get what I'm saying? So
Mm-hmm.
like, or rather, even if what they're sharing is not necessarily a good thing. So what we have in the case of like all of these cases where people are refusing to believe experiencing sexual violence, or rather that they're like taking the victimhood of men, it's because women are typically sort of stereotyped into this space of victimhood. And it makes it really challenging for women to be held accountable. And especially on the internet, when we see women who are typically very transparent and who talk about basically everything, that's often conflated with being a good person. And so, sorry, this is kind of like a roundabout conversation, but the point is,
No, it's helpful. It's helpful because I asked you I've sent over these questions ahead of the podcast, like ahead of today. And I was like, should we or shouldn't we try to introduce like this example of what, seemed like TikTok drama that was like really blew up on like a certain side of TikTok for a few days
right.
in early March, I want to say. It feels
Yeah.
like ages ago, but I guess I'll try to like summarize it for people who aren't on TikTok or who have very different algorithms than me. If you have anything to add, please step in. Denisha and Khalil are two TikTokers, fairly popular accounts. I think Denisha has like over 1 million followers. Khalil has like a couple 100,000. In this situation, Khalil came out as experiencing like feeling like he was being coerced into sex with Denisha. And immediately you had a lot of people who were Denisha defenders, also just people who are like noticing the drama and feeling like they wanted to react to it. And so
Yeah.
saying like, oh, that couldn't be, or you must be like, you must be gay, like if getting to have sex with this person who,
Who's famous.
Khalil was experiencing as like this was coercion.
Yeah. So I think that Khalil's case is pretty like textbook for pulling men into the alt-right, actually. And this is why I commented on it. Like generally I don't comment on we perceive as TikTok drama. What I will say is this. I think that a lot of the times as a sociologist, my job is to always try to reframe things that we view as drama into a serious social sort of setting,
Yeah.
just so that I can give it some legitimacy so that I can observe it from that point of view. And so what I immediately saw was that people were saying that because Khalil is a light-skinned Black man, that he should have no value placed on what he has to say in terms of his experience with sexual violence from a dark-skinned Black woman who is also nearly 2 million followers strong. And that is a very classic case that the alt-right is going to use as a narrative, probably is already using because Nisha has a huge platform. Because the thing is that I don't think that they're after Khalil. They're after everybody else who's watching.
Yeah.
Because one of the narratives that they basically use is that one of their slogans is that rape isn't male. Rape isn't male, meaning that like it's not intrinsically men who are sexually violent. And so what they're arguing is that women are a lot more likely to commit these acts of sexual violence than we think. And that when they do, it's not just ignored, it's perhaps even laughed at because men are viewed as dominant in the relationship, and especially in Khalil's case, because he's light-skinned and he has more privilege when it comes to colorism, men are going to use these narratives to radicalize Black men into the manosphere. Because they're saying, like, oh, because of these deference politics, this case of sexual used as like a weapon against this man, right? And the problem is that it's true. It is being ignored, and that people absolutely aren't paying attention. And the few people that do care and that do want to help Khalil reach some form of justice, right? Whatever that might look like for Khalil, the problem is that those people are very few. And they're typically people who are on the far left, people who are politically aligned with moral consistency, right? We believe that sexual violence is sexual violence, doesn't matter who it comes from. Stalking is wrong. It doesn't matter what your identity is, right? And so this is a concept I like to really quote back to a specific book, which is Elite Capture by Olufemi Otaiwo. And it's this idea that because people of color are people of color, or because marginalized people are marginalized, that we should defer to them, right? But what does that mean, right? What does it mean to defer to somebody because they're marginalized? Should we defer to Candace Owens? Should we defer to Clarence Thomas? These are marginalized people, objectively. Should we defer to Kanye West?
Right.
It was like pinnacle example of the far right now.
Milo Yiannopoulos is, boss.
Fuentes, all of these other people, all these men of color that we talked about earlier, and all of these queer alt-right people.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah.
And so we have here a clear-cut case of deference politics, the belief that we should defer to people just because they're marginalized. That is not reasonable. And I wrote a little bit about this in some of my notes, but the Black Panther Party, they had a 10-point program which argued that you have to be basically judged by your peers in order for it to be legitimate. And for the Black Panther Party, I would say that they would argue that other leftists are their peers. Communists are their peers. Other, Black leftists are their peers. And I would say that in Khalil's case, Black leftists are Khalil's peers. And the majority of the people that were like imposing these judgments on Khalil and saying that Khalil was lying, they were people who are liberals, who basically were saying that because Khalil didn't vote for a liberal, that his opinion was null and void about his own experience of sexual violence. We're lucky Khalil is a leftist, because if he wasn't, he absolutely could be radicalized into the alt-right by this.
Yeah. No, it's unfortunate. Like, another thing that people who maybe aren't on TikTok and see in the discourse, like, since November, there's been so much chatter about or between people who decided like not to vote and people who voted for Kamala Harris, like, whether begrudgingly or not. Yeah, I mean, so much chiding on the side of, people who did vote, even though it's 6 months later. We need to like think about like what's ahead. I think so many of those conversations, I don't see us having like a positive resolution in any form. We have to talk about like capitalism on this podcast. And I think you sort of like made a note that is a good segue into that. And that is how, like the judgment from liberals is still like a capitalist based judgment.
Yeah, so neoliberalism and capitalism have two key factors: neoliberalism and Republican conservatism. respectively. They have two key features and two key elements of similarities. Free enterprise is a synonym for free market trade. The liberal component of liberalism does not have anything to do with social freedoms in its initial definition. It actually has entirely everything to do with free market trade. Now, I want to give a quick synopsis here of what free market trade means under capitalism because it's not actually free. I think it's a misnomer. I would actually, if I were to rename it, I would call it forced market trade because capitalism requires constant production. Not only does capitalism require constant production, it also requires constant consumption to generate capital, right? And that's how we get capitalists, people who like to consume and who like to require more people to produce in order for them to harbor capital, right? So if that's how we understand capitalism, and we understand that liberalism and conservatism, respectively, which are the Democrats and the Republicans' ideology, are both couched under free market enterprise, the only difference between both of these entities is something that they would consider social liberty. But those social liberties are always under the subjugation of free market enterprise. So if at any point your human rights come in between the capital, the production of capital, then your rights are going to be chopped first because free enterprise is the primary ideological approach to capitalism that both liberals and Democrats have. That's why you see them working in bipartisan ways all the time. And so this, of course, functionally turns into another gateway to the alt-right, right? Because if you're from the global South and, you're seeing your people basically be subject to both Democrats and Republicans' policy in the same capacity, and you try to raise your voice anywhere in the United States, and the Republicans are the only ones willing to listen to you, because I will say this about neoliberals. They tend to be a lot more harmful to their own campaign, whereas Republicans are very friendly. And this is a part of like the great white replacement theory. There's a lot of cultural stuff that goes along with that.
On TikTok, and increasingly, I mean, this is how people are getting information, is these platforms like short form video. Nobody's reading the 2,000 word articles that I used to write back in the day.
They should.
And I think it's like, it's just helpful to know like how people are discoursing or why they're discoursing in this way is related to capitalism, like the lack of nuance that you see, the black and white thinking that you see in short form content. It's encouraged the platforms, like you were saying, like, they feed off of like a never ending content stream. And I think, talking about Democrats and Republicans can agree on the free market being like this net positive for society, like especially in Silicon Valley, like the accelerationists, the libertarian, all of the CEOs at these companies are all like agreeing on this belief that straight up capitalism without any regulations is going to move the human race forward. And I mean, that's just a point on which I can never agree.
I think that the primary vehicle that people are using in terms of how they consume news media right now is inherently and intrinsically capitalist, right? Like short form content is very much like a product of our attention spans, which are a product of how we consume, how quickly we feel like we need to consume information. And I've said this multiple times in my video, but 54% of Americans are at a 6th grade reading level. And that means that more than half the country, on average, can't read a scientific journal. They can't read, really basic information. What we just delved into was very complex theory around what capitalism and these social and ideological approaches to capitalism are. And so this ideologically is something that Americans have a really hard time digesting because they don't have the education to know. You have people consuming short form content and like maybe not even getting to the end of it, kind of like the TikTok version of just reading a headline. And so you have people who are engaging in media in this way, and they're not really listening to the extent of the theory that's behind, these principles.
Right.
And because of that, people can't make connections to what's happening to them And that also turns into an alt-right pipeline.
Right. So in so many cases, yeah, like the right wing content that we're seeing, whether it's a podcast or Fuentes, like on TikTok, short form content, like if they are stating it in a way that is confident and like they're stating it as truth, there's not enough like critical thinking necessarily that is going on with the consumer of that content to question like whether or not like, oh, maybe this isn't the full story. And then we as like content creators, you are a much more prolific and much bigger account
Which
than
is
me, but like
surprising, to be
we're
honest.
we're like, we're sort of pushed by the platforms with like things like, if you step away from TikTok for a few days, even like the algorithm will dock you for that and make it harder to get your content out to more people. There's all these little ways that the platforms sort of incentivize you stating black and white truths, like coming out with an opinion, a take on things like are these people that I will probably never meet in real life, like Khalil and Denisha, like this, like seeming like drama between two people. I should like note there though that I think
I get what you mean. So I think
yeah,
what you're saying is that like people are coming out with what they consider hot takes, but actually they're just contrarian takes.
right.
And they're not really hot takes. They're just people who are like saying that people, what first of all, Khalil's case is particularly interesting because there's mountains of evidence and there's a secondary victim. Like mountains of evidence. We're talking text, video evidence of Denisha admitting that she had
Mm,
somebody doxxed. Video evidence. Like
yeah.
if this were the court of law, it would be one of those cases where they have the whole kit and everything, and they have like the fingerprints and everything, and like people are still denying it. And so
Hmm.
our job as social political commentators, yours as a journalist, is to observe and like be like, why the fuck do people still not believe him? And
Yeah.
what does it mean for our society?
Yeah. That there's this like religiosity, like she has way more followers. People have been like following her content for much
Stan
longer.
culture,
Yeah.
stan culture, and
Yeah.
parasocial relationships.
Yeah. And I want to note like when I use the word drama, it probably is discounting the situation a bit because I think like
No, I
you have
think it
brought
is
up,
drama. Absolutely.
like it is drama, but at the same time, like I think that people discount like talking about celebrities or like, I think it's actually a misogynistic kind of thing, even though I think straight guys are they're just as like celebrity obsessed as women, but maybe it's like a different there's just like a different tone to it. But I mean, I think even cases where it might just look like drama online, it's these are all like good examples of like the way that you were able to like kind of flip it into something that I think was like a teaching moment for people, including myself. It was like we just need more of that, like because all of these, yeah, even all these dramas, there are like sociological, there's gender studies aspects to all of these what seems like drama on the internet.
I have so much to say about that because, okay, I have to plug my favorite book, which is The Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici.
Cool.
She coined the term reproductive labor, and it's like an emotional labor type of thing, but also like a lot more than that. Like it goes from like wiping your kid's ass all the way to like raising it into an adult and like women being ignored about it. But basically, one of the things that she talks about in this book is that the word gossip is heavily criminalized.
Mm,
And it originally is a word to describe the relationship between women. And and the point being that I don't necessarily view drama as like a negative thing. When I say the word drama, I like to say what we perceive as drama because I don't think that drama is inherently negative to talk about, and I don't think that frivolity is something that should be applied to most of these situations because I take everything seriously, unfortunately.
I mean, yeah, like being earnest on the internet, obviously, during a time when, apparently it's super cringe to be earnest, feels like,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh,
Yeah, I take everything really seriously. And so I view gossip, I view drama, I view like all of these things as elements that should be taken seriously because they're cultural products. And I
yeah,
view all cultural relics, all cultural products as important. And like I'm only clarifying when I say like what we perceive as drama is because I don't want people to think that like it's just drama. There's something more, right? There's always something more.
yeah, yeah. We could also discuss a bit about like what alt-right even is. Like, I mean, I think back to Vice magazine, Proud Boys came out of like one of the old like founders of Vice magazine back in the day. Vice like started out as like more of a like a pop cultural like sort of like skater even like magazine. But clearly like a lot of the people who were reading it, including one of the co-founders, like felt like wanted to create a culture for people who weren't the traditional form of like the Republicans, the traditional right didn't click for them. And so they created this alternate universe that is the alt-right. Where does that come from?
The alt-right itself is actually as old as the United States is. And I think what people fail to realize, or maybe like people just don't know, but race as we know it, right? Like the black-white color line and all of the intersections and intersectionality in and of itself, all of these are social and political philosophies that can trace the invention of white supremacy and thus the invention of whiteness as a race to the United States. It's quite literally documented. There's legislation around it. The critical race theory article that discusses this, I think, the most comprehensively is Cheryl Harris's Whiteness as Property. And it basically argues that whiteness is essentially the legal relationship that you have with property. And there's a lot to be said about that, but really that would require me to talk about really extensive social
We will,
constructs.
yeah, we'll
But
link to all of these in the show notes for sure.
awesome. Yeah, but I would say that her literature on the subject is probably the most comprehensive in terms of how you can trace the creation of whiteness to the United States. And of course, we see that like capitalism necessitates production. We talked a little bit about that. In order to produce capital in a way that's really harmful and to basically manufacture consent for people to participate in it, they have to create stratification. They have to create like bigotry. They have to create like, these sort of ad hoc social structures to basically get people to like be okay with having to be exploited to produce for the bourgeoisie, for the rich. This is what we saw during slavery. Slavery was quite literally created in the name of the production of capital. That's literally what it's for. It's for capitalism. It's in service of capitalism. The Holocaust was quite literally a result of capitalism. Germany was at that time accused of a bunch of crimes during World War I, and they were asked to pay back a bunch of reparations which they didn't actually owe because they weren't responsible for the entirety of World War I. And this ultimately led to the rise of Hitler, who used migrants and other marginalizations to justify why the economy was so bad. And so he used capitalism as a vehicle, or rather, he used social stratification as a vehicle to justify his atrocities because he was trying to basically figure out how to manufacture a better form of capitalism for white people, for white supremacists in Germany. So we see that racism, Zionism, white supremacy, these are all financial institutions. So the alt-right is not new. It's actually as old as the United States is. And not only is it as old as the United States is, people are actually just going back to their roots in many ways. In the United States, because capitalism exists, it has produced a lot of excuses for exploitation. And we actually saw this during the civil rights movement in a really overt way, when the Soviet Union was like, oh, you're all so democratic, and yet you have Jim Crow.
Right.
So
Right.
so the
Yeah.
Soviet Union really was like, how can you be a democracy? How can you be land of the free, home of the brave, if
Yeah.
you are killing off your Black population who no longer is in service to you because of capitalism? Because at this point, we had the Emancipation Proclamation. So these are financial institutions. So the alt-right has existed for a long time. I think what we're seeing is a rise of these, institutions basically becoming endorsed because the economy is deteriorating because we are in late stage capitalism. We're probably beyond late stage capitalism. We're on our way to Samaya likes to say that we're on our way to barbarism. And I
Yeah.
really agree with that. I think,
Samaya is, yeah, excellent follow on TikTok.
oh yeah,
Also in
definitely.
the Bay Area. I'd like totally, yeah, I am huge fan, huge parasocial relationship with Samaya for
Samaya,
me.
I know Samaya's great.
We'll also link to Samaya too. If you feel cool with this, like we could move into alternatives to the situation now, like solutions, sort of, which, yeah, are definitely necessary. The whole reason that I wanted to talk to you was because I do think it's like we need to be like sort of on high alert around how
Like, how do we
how
stop
how
it?
present, like, yeah, the manosphere, like these podcasters, these content creators are, and how they are a major relationship and influence in so many people's lives. Yeah, I mean, I asked on a recent episode to people who make content who are like straight cis guys who I think are making more like left content, and like what can we do in the context of the last election is actually how I asked it, where like how did it come to be that like somebody who was so like clearly like detested by so many people and like just outwardly hateful would get reelected. And the response was like, well, like the Democrats weren't really giving an alternative for some of the reasons that we've laid out in this episode, in large part capitalism being so like the base of both the Republican and Democrat parties. But yeah, I know that you had some ideas around like where do we go from here.
I mean, I do want to say, because I think it's bears repeating, even though people have talked about this at length. The genocide in Palestine is also a product of capitalism. Zionism, as I said, and so when we talk about like what we can do and like how we should respond to these democratic moments, these partisan political moments, I think we need to stop seeing Democrats and Republicans as separate parties, because the global South doesn't see them as separate parties. I can tell you that. Like, living in Mexico, Democrats and Republicans have horrific policy on Mexico. And we have like a water contract that's extremely exploitative that came out of Donald Trump and Biden. And not to mention the fact that, Biden and Trump both have horrific policy on migrants. Anyway, that point aside, I do want to say that it's probably not really sexy to most people, but education is like probably the biggest feature of like what we need to do. And I think a lot of leftists, especially in the United States, when they basically go into academic spaces, they view academia from the point of view of, or what rather, they don't go into academic spaces because they view academia as like an elite institution and an institution that they shouldn't really acknowledge or believe that it's important in any capacity. And I do think that there's value in interrogating the structure. Like, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but universities now are basically just banking institutions with extra steps. But I still think that you should view your education as a right that you are obligated to pursue. And like, not just as something that has been impacted by capitalism, has been impacted by these problems that we have in our society, but also as something that is your human right that you absolutely have to pursue by any means necessary. It's like the most important thing that you should try to attain, because there is a lot of legislation coming down the pipelines to basically make your education not possible. And so I think that's the beginning. And it's not sexy. It's not sexy to hear like, you gotta go to school.
I mean, I am constantly thinking, yeah, like, I mean, the things that come up on this podcast and just for me, like when I'm thinking about like, what do we need to change? It is like just the most basic ass things like housing, education, healthcare. And I feel like, I mean, it is, yeah, I mean, it's helpful just to be reminded. It's like, if we had these basics, like education. Clearly, at one point in the US history, like I'm always thinking about how the UCs and CSUs were tuition free for California residents up until the 70s. And,
Reagan.
that my parents were going to college around that time. It is wild that like there was such a concerted effort by people who saw education as such a threat to their control of society that they said no, we can't be having this free tuition anymore, and they got rid of it.
Yeah, because I mean, look, Andrew Tate doesn't survive an educated audience.
Yeah.
Andrew Tate does not survive.
Yep.
Ben Shapiro doesn't survive an educated audience. Donald Trump is not educated. A lot of people think that he can't read. Of course,
Yeah.
he's king of an illiterate world.
Mm-hmm.
As a person from the global south, our education was interfered significantly since the 40s by the United States. We had a social movement called the Porril movement, which was basically the American-backed dictatorship was imposing these federalist unions that was to crack down on communist students. It was like another iteration of McCarthyism, and they killed thousands of students and injured thousands of students. And what we saw was that one of the primary reasons this crackdown was happening was because students have a massive understanding and a massive political power. They know what they need to do next. And it's because they study these realities. Even if you have a terrible quality education, as long as you get the basics, you can figure out what the solution is. You can learn how to counter-indicate your own the misinformation inside of your institution, because you're taught as a student, especially if you're at a relatively good institution, to question that institution. And so you learn how to really criticize the world that you live in. And also you learn the tools to criticize it. That doesn't mean that people can't weaponize it for evil. They absolutely can and do. But in a world of educated people, if everybody's kind of like at a similar level of education, it makes it a lot harder for people who are bad actors to get away with things. But right now, half the country can't read a scientific journal. That should say a lot. And your TikTok, your work should be more popular than mine. I am not a journalist. I am not a journalist. I am a sociologist and a political theorist. I'm a student. Right. But I'm a student. And the fact is, somebody who is a journalist isn't getting like that is significant to me as a sociologist. I associate a lot with journalists, and I like journalists because I believe in the institution of journalism. Does that mean that journalism is always used for good in the United States? No. But does it mean that as an academic, as a student, I understand that like criticizing the institution is valid, but also needing the institution is also a reality that we live in?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
I sometimes say misinformation. If we had more creators that were better educated, more journalists, I would bet money that your platform would be doing better, because people want to know accurate information from if they have an education about why that's important. So I think, that's kind of like the goal of my TikTok, is to be an alt-left pipeline.
Yeah.
to incentivize people to come and listen to facts. Like I try to, and I said this in my notes too, whenever anybody says any misinformation in my comments, I either delete it or I ask them to source what they stated. And I'll approve the comment. If they have a source, I'll approve the comment. So generally, it's important that, people really get an education, and then it's not attractive. And a lot of people don't want to hear it, especially leftists don't want to hear it because of academic elitism and like all this other stuff. But the fact is that it's our right to have an education, and that is the like foremost principle of leftism. You have to have an education. You have to know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always thinking about like when I learned about Cuba's literacy rate being like near 100%, people like being able to read above sixth grade level versus the US. I mean, I think even, like with the economic might versus like the literacy rate, I would take that literacy rate. anytime.
Palestinians are considered like I think the most educated refugee group in the world.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
they understand the necessity, I think, of knowing what they're saying because they have to talk to media,
Right.
and when they have to talk to media, they have to cite sources off the top of their head. They have to know what they're talking about. They can't just say anything because they understand the stakes. And I think that Americans mistakenly believe that the stakes are not the same for them, but they are.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, unfortunately, yeah, they are. I guess like a couple last things before I let you go. One thing that I had written in the notes, like, oh, like, is one solution to move offline? And I feel like I appreciate your pushback on that. I think you had some good points if you want to like elaborate on like why moving offline isn't necessarily like an end all for saving the world.
I'm not sure if it's pushback. I really don't know, to be honest with you. I don't know if it's the right thing. I can say that in the case of Palestine, social media has a positive case because a lot of people didn't know what was happening about Palestine
Yeah.
before what was getting published on TikTok.
I
And
think,
still,
yeah, if we wouldn't see like the Zionist attempt to ban TikTok if it weren't for it having a positive effect.
yeah. So I think there's cases on both sides, but also Ben Shapiro exists and debate culture exists. I think there is a world in which social media can be used for good and short form content even can be used for good. And I really think the early versions of TikTok, particularly during the pandemic, were really helpful for people to get education and to form social connections and social cohesions. I view basically everything in a neutral way, but I think that it can be weaponized in a variety of ways. And I think that one of the ways that TikTok in particular has been used by the alt-right is in a very overt political way. And I think it goes back to capitalism. I think the fact is that capital controls the production of capitalism, of TikTok. It controls the outcomes of TikTok. We saw very overtly that Shou Chu, you know, was trying to make his money-making machine survive. And so he was willing to collaborate with other capitalists to produce his capital,
Right. This is
which
CEO of TikTok. Yeah.
absolutely. So we see that like the material reality absolutely does have a sort of really clear relationship with these tools that we use. And so I think if we're in a capitalist society, then all of our tools are going to be affiliated with capitalism, all of them, because they have to be funded to put it really really blatantly. But I think that in a communist space, in maybe a new social and economic structure, would that relationship change? The global south uses social media in a completely different capacity than the United States. I would say that most Mexicans are not on social media at the same level. Like I think the global south has a very different relationship with these tools because their production is not prioritized in their culture. And I think like, the financial aspect of it is not a priority for a lot of people in the global south because the global south is much more concerned with its survival. Yeah, so those are my thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, I think I think that just it and the way that it, has become the principal way that people consume information and news and communicate makes I think it's important that there are pushback against the right wing, the alt-right pipeline, which yeah, super appreciate like you for the content that you've been doing to do that.
Like your content is amazing. I think like the exposures that you do on politicians in San Francisco, like I really think that people don't understand that San Francisco, New York, and Chicago, and like probably Ferguson are the cities that have the most social and political impact in the United States.
Hmm.
Like Los Angeles too, but probably a little bit more adjacent. Um, but I would say that like a lot of dissent comes out of the Bay Area and a lot of like political social movements get their start here. And so I think there's like a particular repression happening in
Yeah.
the area. And I think that more people should pay attention to your channel.
Yeah. Oh,
I think it's
well.
so underrated.
Thank you. I like to think that it was because I only seriously started posting like a year ago or so.
Oh
And
yeah, you
I
have
don't know.
time. I've been posting for like 2 years now. So
Well, I have been a big fan of yours for a while now, so I'm so stoked that you said yes, and I would love to have you back anytime you feel like, talking some shit. Let this be another platform for you, if you're down, and of course we're gonna link to your social media, which everybody should go immediately to follow for amazing commentary and analysis on things that are happening in the US, things that are happening in Mexico as well, things that are happening online in the Manosphere. Is there anything else that you're working on that you want to, let people know about?
I am working on a podcast actually myself.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mine is gonna be between my husband and I. We're doing a therapist versus sociologist sort of commentary on like Mexican politics, Vietnamese politics probably because my husband's Vietnamese, and sort of topics like very general topics, sort of like sociological commentary, a lot of stuff like that. But yeah, we should have you on our podcast too.
Totally down. And yeah, we'll definitely like let people know when you all launch.
It's gonna launch. I want to say within the next couple days, actually.
Sweet.
So
Okay,
soon,
perfect.
soon.
Perfect
Yeah, it's
timing.
gonna be on my usual channels. It'll be on my link tree. But I'm also gonna have your podcast featured on my link tree. So send me the link to it once you
Okay,
post it, so I can
I
put it
will.
up. And I'll
For
do a
sure.
little advertisement on my TikTok too.
Amazing. All right, cool. All right, well, we'll talk soon.
All right.
Bye. Thank you for listening to Sad Francisco. I am Toshio Meronek, and my co-producer is Tofu Estolas. Patreon.com/Sad Francisco is where you can find our past episodes and transcripts, and it's also where you can help us out with a donation. And if you do, it comes with some benefits like getting the episodes a few days early, and our gratitude for allowing us to keep making this podcast, which we love to do. See you next time in Sad Francisco.